My name is Eleanor, and at 67 years old, I never imagined my own son would tell me to get out of my home the day we buried my husband of 45 years. Harold and I had built a life together, raised our children in that house, and created thousands of memories within those walls. But Thomas had no idea what I had already done in the months before his father passed away. The betrayal in his eyes that day was nothing compared to the shock he would feel later. Before I continue my story, I would love to know where you are watching from. Please drop your location in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you want to hear more stories about family, betrayal, and finding strength when you least expect it. Harold and I met during our sophomore year at Rutgers University. I was studying education, dreaming of becoming a teacher, while he was pursuing a business degree with big ambitions. We quite literally bumped into each other at the campus library one rainy April afternoon. I was carrying a stack of books that went flying everywhere, and Harold helped me gather them. He asked me out for coffee that same day, and within 6 months we were inseparable. We married the summer after graduation in a small ceremony with just family and close friends. Harold had already secured a position at a financial firm in New Jersey, and I found a job teaching 4th grade at a local elementary school. Those early years were challenging but sweet. We lived in a tiny one-bedroom apartment, saved every penny, and dreamed about our future together. 3 years into our marriage, I became pregnant with Thomas. Harold was ecstatic at the news of becoming a father. By then, he had already received his first big promotion, and we had just enough saved to put a modest down payment on the colonial house in the suburbs that would become our family home for the next 4 decades. When Thomas was born, Harold insisted I stay home with him. "A child needs his mother," he said, and though I loved teaching, I agreed. My career was put on hold, and I embraced motherhood wholeheartedly. 3 years later, our daughter Rebecca joined our family, completing our little unit of 4. As the children grew, Harold climbed higher in his company, eventually becoming a senior investment banker. Our financial situation improved dramatically, but with that came Harold's increasing control over our finances. He managed everything: the mortgage, investments, retirement accounts, and even our daily expenses. At the time, I saw it as him taking care of us, protecting our family's future. I never questioned it. Thomas was always more like his father. Ambitious, sometimes stubborn, with a keen interest in money and status from an early age. Rebecca was my gentle soul, creative and compassionate. They both excelled in school, though in different ways. Thomas was analytical and competitive, while Rebecca thrived in literature and the arts. When it came time for college, Rebecca chose to attend UCLA, clear across the country. It broke my heart a little, but I understood her desire to explore beyond our East Coast bubble. She flourished in California, majoring in English literature, and after graduation she settled in San Francisco, eventually meeting her husband Michael and starting her own family there. Thomas stayed closer to home, attending Princeton, where he studied finance like his father. During his junior year, he met Stephanie at a fraternity party. She was pretty, ambitious, and came from a wealthy family in Connecticut. Harold approved of the match immediately. After graduation, Thomas joined Harold's firm, and within a year, he and Stephanie were married in an extravagant ceremony that cost more than our house had originally. They bought a large home just 20 minutes from us, and within a few years, gave us 2 beautiful grandchildren, Emily and Jacob. On the surface, everything seemed perfect. Harold was grooming Thomas to eventually take over his clients and position. Stephanie decorated their home with expensive furniture and took lavish vacations. I doted on my grandchildren and maintained our family home. But there were small signs I chose to ignore. The way Thomas spoke down to waitstaff at restaurants. How he complained about taxes and freeloaders in society. His impatience with his own children when they interrupted his work calls. I would catch Harold watching him sometimes with a slight frown, but when I asked about it, he would just say, "He's young. He'll mature." I noticed Stephanie's eyes lingering on our antique furniture during family dinners, or her casual questions about Harold's watch collection or my grandmother's jewelry. But I dismissed these observations as my own paranoia. They were family after all. And family was everything to Harold and me. Looking back, I realize how naive I was. How willingly I had put on blinders to maintain the image of our perfect family. The cracks were there all along, but I painted over them with excuses and justifications. It would take Harold's illness to reveal the true picture beneath. The diagnosis came suddenly, just after Harold's 70th birthday. What we thought was persistent indigestion turned out to be pancreatic cancer, already advanced by the time they found it. The doctor delivered the news with practiced compassion, but nothing could soften the blow. Stage 4. Inoperable. 6 to 12 months. With treatment. Harold took the news with the same stoicism he approached everything in life. "We need to be practical, Eleanor," he said that night in our bedroom, holding my trembling hands. "There are things we need to arrange." I was still in shock, unable to imagine a world without him. For the first few weeks, the family rallied around us. Rebecca flew in from San Francisco for a week, helping me set up a system to manage Harold's medications and appointments. Thomas and Stephanie brought dinner over several times and took the lead in researching treatment options and specialists. Harold started an aggressive chemotherapy regimen that left him exhausted and nauseous. I transformed our living room into a bedroom, so he wouldn't have to climb the stairs. My days became a blur of medication schedules, doctor appointments, and trying to keep Harold comfortable. In those early days, Thomas visited frequently, usually on his way home from the office. It was during one of these visits, about 3 weeks after the diagnosis, that I first noticed something was off. Harold was napping, and Thomas and I were having coffee in the kitchen. "Dad's updated his will recently, right?" Thomas asked, stirring his coffee with unusual focus. The question caught me off guard. "I'm not sure. Why do you ask?" Thomas shrugged, not meeting my eyes. "Just thinking ahead. Making sure everything's in order for you, Mom. And for the family assets, of course." Something in his tone made me uncomfortable, but I brushed it off as him processing his father's illness in his own way. As the weeks passed, Harold's condition deteriorated faster than the doctors had predicted. The cancer was aggressive, and the chemotherapy seemed to be doing more harm than good. After 2 months, Harold decided to stop treatment and focus on quality of life for whatever time he had left. Thomas's visits became less frequent, always with an excuse about work pressure or the children's activities. Stephanie stopped coming altogether. Rebecca called daily but could only visit once a month due to her own family and work obligations. I understood her constraints, but Thomas lived just 20 minutes away. I became Harold's full-time caregiver, learning to administer injections, manage his pain medication, and help him with the most basic tasks. Our bedroom became a makeshift hospital room. Some nights when Harold was finally asleep, I would sit in our bathroom and cry silently, overwhelmed by the physical and emotional toll. One evening, while organizing Harold's desk to pay some bills, I came across bank statements that confused me. There were large withdrawals from our joint investment account over the past year that I knew nothing about. $50,000 here, $75,000 there. Almost $400,000 in total. When I showed Harold the statements, he sighed deeply and closed his eyes. For a moment, I thought he had fallen asleep, but then he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't want to worry you, especially not now. Thomas made some investment decisions that didn't pan out." "What do you mean?" I asked, my heart beginning to race. "He convinced me to invest in a friend's startup, then a real estate venture. Neither worked out." Harold's voice was strained. "I should have told you." The next day, when Thomas visited, I confronted him while Harold was resting. "What happened to the money from the Vanguard account?" I asked directly. Thomas's expression shifted from surprise to defensiveness in an instant. "Dad and I made some investments together. Business decisions. $400,000, Thomas. Without telling me." He straightened his shoulders, resembling Harold when he was preparing to shut down a discussion. "Mom, with all due respect, Dad and I handled the finances. He approved everything. It's unfortunate the ventures didn't succeed, but that's business. Risk is part of creating wealth. Your father is dying, and you're talking about creating wealth?" My voice shook with anger and disbelief. Thomas's expression hardened. "I'm being realistic. Dad would expect us to think about the family's financial future. Your future, Mom." The conversation ended there, but something fundamental had shifted between us. For the first time, I saw my son clearly, without the filter of maternal love clouding my judgment. And what I saw frightened me. That night, after Thomas left, Harold was more lucid than he had been in days. He asked me to sit beside him on the bed, his thin hand gripping mine with surprising strength. "I heard you and Thomas earlier," he said. "There's something I need to tell you." Over the next hour, as darkness fell outside our window, Harold revealed the full extent of Thomas's financial actions. It wasn't just the failed investments. Thomas had been making increasingly risky decisions with family money, ignoring Harold's more conservative advice. After the last venture failed, Harold had quietly removed Thomas's access to most of the accounts. "I should have done it sooner," Harold admitted, regret heavy in his voice. "I wanted to believe he was learning, maturing. But he's become reckless, Eleanor. And I'm worried about what will happen to you when I'm gone." The next morning, while Harold slept, I called Frank Bennett, Harold's attorney and friend of 30 years. I asked for an urgent meeting. Frank, understanding the gravity of the situation, came to our house that afternoon. In Harold's study with the door closed, Frank confirmed what I had begun to fear. Thomas had been pressing Harold about the will and inheritance details for months, even before the cancer diagnosis. Harold had confided in Frank about his concerns regarding Thomas's financial judgment. "Harold has been making arrangements, Eleanor," Frank explained gently. "He wanted to make sure you were protected." Frank showed me documents Harold had signed just weeks before his diagnosis. A significant portion of their assets had been placed in a trust that would provide for me for the rest of my life. Thomas couldn't touch it. There was also a separate account in my name alone with enough to sustain me for years if necessary. "Harold knew Thomas might not take this well," Frank said. "But his priority was ensuring your security." After Frank left, I sat alone in the kitchen, my mind racing. For 45 years, I had left the financial decisions to Harold. Now I needed to educate myself quickly. I made an appointment with a financial advisor recommended by Frank, someone who had no connection to Thomas or Harold's firm. Over the next few weeks, as Harold's condition continued to decline, I operated on two parallel tracks. Outwardly, I was the devoted wife and caregiver, managing Harold's increasing pain and declining mobility. But in the hours when he slept, I was preparing for a future I had never imagined. I documented our household valuables and heirlooms, taking photos and noting which items had special significance. I opened a new email account and phone number that Thomas didn't know about. I researched senior living communities in San Francisco, near Rebecca, as a potential option for the future. Harold and I had several more difficult conversations during his more lucid moments. He insisted on making additional changes to the will, further protecting me from Thomas's potential actions. Each time Frank visited with new documents, Harold signed them with a shaking hand but clear determination in his eyes. "Promise me you won't let Thomas bully you," Harold said one evening, his voice so weak I had to lean close to hear him. "He's still our son and I love him. But he's lost his way, Eleanor. And you deserve peace in your remaining years." I promised, though in my heart I still hoped it wouldn't come to that. Surely Thomas would step up when Harold was gone. Surely grief would soften his focus on money and assets. One night, Rebecca called with concerns of her own. During her last visit, she had overheard Thomas talking to Stephanie about plans for the house after Harold was gone. When she questioned him, he had been dismissive, saying he was just trying to be practical about my future. "Mom, I don't like how he's talking about this," Rebecca said, her voice tense with worry. "Like he's already decided what's going to happen to you and the house." I reassured her that Harold had taken steps to protect me, but her concern added to my growing unease about what would happen after Harold was gone. The hospital bed in our living room became the center of our world as Harold entered what the hospice nurse gently called the transition phase. I barely slept, wanting to be present for every moment we had left. And in those quiet night hours, sitting beside my dying husband, my secret preparations continued in my mind. Not out of greed or vengeance, but out of a growing certainty that I would need to protect myself from my own son. Harold passed away peacefully on a Tuesday morning in October. I was holding his hand, Rebecca was on the phone from San Francisco, and despite my calls to Thomas, He arrived 15 minutes after his father had taken his last breath. He burst into the room, still in his suit from work, his face flushed from rushing. "Is he?" Thomas began, looking at Harold's still form on the hospital bed. "He's gone," I said simply, still holding Harold's cooling hand. "About 15 minutes ago." Thomas's face went through a series of expressions: shock, grief, and then something else I couldn't quite identify. He stepped out to call Stephanie, and when he returned, his demeanor had changed subtly. More composed. More focused. While the hospice nurse was still in the house, before Harold's body had even been removed, Thomas pulled me aside into the kitchen. "Mom, we need to talk about the will and arrangements," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Did Dad leave specific instructions?" I stared at my son, unable to believe what I was hearing. "Thomas, your father just died." "I know, Mom, and I'm devastated," he said quickly. "But there are practicalities to consider. The funeral, the estate. Dad would want us to handle things efficiently." I didn't argue, simply telling him that Frank would handle everything according to Harold's wishes. Something flickered in Thomas's eyes, uncertainty, perhaps concern, but he nodded and returned to the living room where the funeral home staff had arrived. The next few days passed in a blur of arrangements. Thomas took charge of the funeral planning, overruling many of my suggestions. The casket I chose was unnecessarily expensive. The reception I wanted to host at our favorite restaurant was extravagant. Instead, he selected the most basic casket option and arranged for a simple reception at the church hall. "We need to be mindful of costs now, Mom," he explained with forced patience when I objected. "Your financial situation has changed." I didn't correct his assumption. Let him believe I was financially vulnerable if that's what he wanted to think. 3 days after Harold died, I came home from picking up my dress for the funeral to find Stephanie in my living room with 2 strangers who were examining the built-in bookshelves and taking measurements. "What's going on?" I asked, setting down my shopping bag. Stephanie jumped slightly, looking guilty. "Oh, Eleanor. These are friends of ours from Berkshire Hathaway. Real estate agents. We were just getting some preliminary ideas for when you're ready to sell." "Sell?" I repeated, my voice steady despite the anger rising within me. "Thomas mentioned you'll probably want to downsize soon," one of the agents said cheerfully. "This is a lot of house for one person." I asked them to leave immediately. After they were gone, I called Thomas at work. "You brought real estate agents to my house without asking me?" "Your father has been dead for 3 days, Thomas." "Mom, I'm just trying to help," he said, his tone condescending. "You can't possibly maintain that house on your own, financially or physically. I've been looking at some nice senior apartments about 10 minutes from us. 1 bedroom, very manageable." I ended the call without responding, too angry to trust myself to speak further. That evening, I discovered that several items were missing from Harold's study: his vintage watch collection, a small bronze sculpture we had bought in Italy, and the rare first edition books he had collected over the years. When confronted, Thomas claimed he was securing valuables during this transitional time. "These things are part of my inheritance, Mom. I'm just making sure nothing gets misplaced." Rebecca arrived the day before the funeral, her face drawn with grief and travel fatigue. She hugged me tightly in the airport terminal, and for the first time since Harold died, I allowed myself to truly cry. "Thomas is acting strange," she whispered as we drove home. "He's called me 3 times asking about Dad's will and what you're planning to do with the house." That night, Thomas and Stephanie hosted a family dinner at their home. What should have been a somber, supportive gathering became an uncomfortable display of their plans for the future. "We're thinking of converting the 3rd bedroom to a proper home office once we move into the main house," Stephanie said casually over dessert. "The lighting is so much better there than in our current house." "What main house?" Rebecca asked, looking between Stephanie and Thomas. "Mom's house, of course," Thomas replied, as if it were already decided. "It makes sense for her to move somewhere smaller and more manageable, while we raise our family in the family home." I said nothing, watching as my son laid out his plans for my future without once asking what I wanted. Rebecca was less restrained, challenging her brother repeatedly until the dinner ended in tense silence. Later that night, I met privately with Frank at my house. He confirmed that everything was in place according to Harold's final wishes. The will reading will be the day after the funeral, Frank said. Thomas is in for quite a surprise. Will you be there to handle things? I asked, suddenly nervous about the confrontation to come. Frank patted my hand reassuringly. Harold made sure you be protected, Eleanor. Legally and financially. Just be prepared for Thomas's reaction. After Frank left, I quietly packed a suitcase with essential items, clothes, toiletries, important documents, and irreplaceable photos. I placed it in the trunk of my car, along with a box of Harold's personal items I couldn't bear to lose. My preparations were complete. Now I just had to get through the funeral. Harold's funeral was held at the Presbyterian church where we had attended services for decades. The sanctuary was filled with colleagues, friends, and family, many of whom I hadn't seen in years. I sat in the front pew, Rebecca on one side of me, Thomas and Stephanie on the other. Thomas gave the eulogy, his voice breaking at carefully timed moments as he spoke about his father's legacy of hard work, financial acumen, and family values. It was a beautiful speech, but I couldn't help noticing how much emphasis he placed on Harold's business success and the dynasty he had built for future generations. Throughout the service, I maintained my composure, greeting people with quiet dignity, accepting condolences with grace. Inside, I felt hollow, going through the motions while bracing myself for what I knew was coming. The reception was held in the church fellowship hall. Thomas had arranged a modest spread of finger sandwiches and punch, nothing like the celebration of life I had wanted for Harold. Still, it was touching to see how many people came to share stories about my husband, to offer support and kindness. As the afternoon wore on, the crowd thinned. Thomas began drinking more heavily, glass after glass of the whiskey he had brought in a flask despite my objections to serving alcohol in the church. By 5 o'clock, only family remained: Thomas, Stephanie, their children Rebecca, and me. The children were getting restless, so Stephanie took them outside to play on the church playground. Rebecca went to help the church ladies clean up the reception area. Thomas and I were alone in a corner of the hall. "We need to talk about tomorrow," he said, his words slightly slurred. "After the will reading." "What about it?" I asked. "I've already contacted a moving company. They can pack up your essential items while we're at Frank's office. The retirement community needs a decision by the end of the week." I stared at my son, still seeking some glimpse of the boy I had raised. "Thomas, I haven't agreed to any retirement community." His face hardened. "Mom, be realistic. You can't afford to keep the house on whatever small portion Dad left you. The property taxes alone would eat up your savings in a few years." "You don't know what your father left me," I said quietly. Thomas laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "I know exactly what he left. I've been handling his accounts for years. There's the house, the investment portfolio, his life insurance policy, and some cash reserves. Most of it is tied to the business, which is coming to me. You'll get a widow's portion, but it won't be enough to maintain your current lifestyle." I said nothing, which seemed to irritate him further. "Look," he continued, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper, "I've arranged everything. The senior apartment is perfect for you. 1 bedroom, little maintenance, a nice community of people your age. I'm being generous here, Mom. Most of my colleagues put their widowed mothers in assisted living facilities." By the time we returned to the house, Thomas was no longer bothering to hide his impatience. He had moved from whiskey to Harold's expensive scotch, pouring himself generous glasses as he wandered through the house, pointing out furniture that would look perfect in their home. Rebecca watched with increasing alarm as her brother's behavior deteriorated. The grandchildren had fallen asleep on the living room sofa, exhausted from the emotional day. "Have you seen what Dad left in the will?" Thomas demanded, cornering me in the kitchen where I was making tea. "Did he show you a copy?" "We should discuss this tomorrow with Frank," I said, trying to move past him. Thomas blocked my path. "I found some statements in Dad's desk. There should be accounts with Henderson Investment Group with over $2 million in them. But when I called, they said those accounts had been closed or transferred." I took a deep breath. "Your father made some changes to his investments in his final months." Thomas's face flushed with anger. "Changes? Without consulting me? I'm the financial expert in this family. What did he do with that money, Mom? That's enough, Thomas, Rebecca said sharply from the doorway. This isn't the time or place. Thomas whirled around. Stay out of this, Becca. You've been gone for years. You have no idea what's been happening here. I know you're treating Mom like she's a problem to be solved rather than a person who just lost her husband, Rebecca shot back. The argument escalated quickly, with Thomas growing more agitated and Rebecca defending me more fiercely. Stephanie came downstairs, annoyed that their shouting had woken the children. This is ridiculous, Thomas finally exploded, slamming his glass down on the counter. Here's what's going to happen. Mom, you're moving out. This house is too valuable an asset to waste on one person. It's part of my inheritance, and I'm not watching its value get eaten away while you rattle around in it alone. Thomas, Stephanie hissed, glancing nervously at me. Not now. No, it needs to be said, Thomas continued, his words running together slightly from the alcohol. Mom, I want you out of this house by the end of the week. You can take your personal items and whatever furniture will fit in the apartment I've arranged. This is my home, I said quietly. Your father and I paid off this mortgage 15 years ago. Thomas laughed bitterly. Your home? Dad paid for this house with his hard work while you stayed home baking cookies. Everything you have is because of him and his money, which is now family money. My family's future. Rebecca stepped between us. Have you lost your mind? You can't kick Mom out of her own house. Thomas turned to his sister, his face contorted with anger. Watch me. If she fights this, I'll contest the will. I'll tie everything up in court for years. She'll be bankrupt from legal fees before it's resolved. He turned back to me, pulling his car keys from his pocket and throwing them at me. They hit my chest and fell to the floor with a clatter. Get out, he said coldly. Take your car and whatever you can fit in it. The rest is ours now. Stephanie gasped. Rebecca lunged at her brother, but I held her back. Thomas, think about what you're doing, Stephanie said, clearly uncomfortable with her husband's public display. I've been thinking about this for months, he replied, not taking his eyes off me. Ever since Dad got sick, and I realized how much of my inheritance was being wasted on keeping up appearances for their generation. It's our turn now. I looked at my son for a long moment, seeing the stranger he had become. Then I nodded once, picked up my purse from the counter, and walked calmly to the hall closet where I retrieved my pre-packed suitcase. Thomas's eyes widened slightly at the sight of it. You were planning to leave anyway? I was prepared for any possibility, I answered, my voice steady despite the trembling in my hands. Even this one. I walked to the front door, Rebecca following in shocked silence. Thomas stood in the hallway, swaying slightly from the alcohol but still defiant. Mom, you can't just leave, Rebecca protested. This is your house. It's fine, dear, I said, squeezing her hand. Everything will be clear tomorrow. I've already made a reservation at the Marriott downtown. I'll see you at Frank's office at 10. As I placed my suitcase in the trunk next to the box I had packed days earlier, Thomas appeared on the front porch. The keys to the house, he demanded, holding out his hand. Leave them. I removed the house key from my keyring and placed it in his palm without a word. Then I got into my car and drove away from the home I had shared with Harold for 4 decades, leaving my bewildered daughter and triumphant son behind. The 20-minute drive to the Marriott was surreal. Street lights blurred through my tears, but I kept driving, one hand on the wheel, the other pressed against my mouth to hold back sobs. I had prepared for this moment intellectually, but nothing could have readied me for the emotional reality of being thrown out of my home by my own child on the day of my husband's funeral. At a red light, I glanced at my reflection in the rearview mirror. My face was pale, eyes red-rimmed, but there was something else there too. A steely determination that reminded me of Harold. The hotel staff were kind, not questioning why a woman my age was checking in alone so late in the evening with just one suitcase. In my room, I sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly exhausted beyond words. My phone buzzed repeatedly with messages from Rebecca, but I couldn't summon the energy to respond yet. A gentle knock on the door startled me. Through the peephole, I saw Rebecca, her face tight with worry. I followed you, she explained as I opened the door. I couldn't let you be alone tonight. We sat together on the bed, and finally, I allowed myself to break down completely. Rebecca held me as I sobbed, decades of maternal strength crumbling in the face of Thomas's betrayal. I knew he was materialistic, Rebecca said when my tears had subsided. But I never imagined he would do something like this. Throwing you out of your own home. It's unforgivable. I wiped my eyes and took a deep breath. Your father suspected this might happen. Thomas has changed over the years, become more entitled, more focused on money and status. What did Dad suspect exactly? Rebecca asked, her brow furrowed. I hesitated, then decided it was time to share at least part of what Harold and I had arranged. Thomas has been making poor financial decisions, pressuring your father to invest in risky ventures. They lost a lot of money. When your father got sick, he made some changes to protect me. Rebecca's phone chimed with a text message. She glanced at it and grimaced. Thomas is losing his mind. He says there are documents missing from Dad's study, and he wants to know where they are. With Frank where they belong, I replied calmly. Mom, what's going on? What happens tomorrow at the will reading? I patted her hand. Your father took care of everything, sweetheart. Try not to worry. That night, I slept surprisingly well, as if a great weight had been lifted. The worst had happened, my son had revealed his true nature and cast me out, and yet I had survived. More than survived, I was prepared. The next morning, Rebecca and I had breakfast in the hotel restaurant before heading to Frank's office. She was still confused and worried, but I felt a strange sense of calm. The battle I had been dreading was almost over. Frank's office was in a professional building downtown, his law practice occupying the entire 4th floor. His assistant showed us into the conference room where Frank was waiting with various documents spread out before him. Eleanor, Rebecca, he greeted us solemnly. I'm so sorry about yesterday. Rebecca called me last night and told me what happened. Thomas hasn't arrived yet? I asked, checking my watch. It was 5 minutes before 10. Not yet, Frank replied. But I expect him shortly. Can I get you both some coffee while we wait? As Frank stepped out to request coffee, Rebecca leaned closer to me. Mom, what exactly is going to happen here? Before I could answer, the conference room door opened again, and Thomas strode in. He was impeccably dressed in a dark suit, his expression controlled and professional. No sign of last night's drunken cruelty. Mother. Rebecca. He nodded curtly before taking a seat across from us. I trust we can handle this quickly and efficiently. I have a meeting at noon. Stephanie followed him in, looking uncomfortable but determined to present a united front with her husband. Frank returned and took his seat at the head of the table. He adjusted his glasses and looked at each of us in turn. We're here for the reading of Harold Bennett's last will and testament, he began formally. Before I proceed, I want to note that Harold was of sound mind when these documents were executed 2 months ago. Everything has been properly witnessed and notarized. Thomas leaned forward slightly, his attention fixed on the folder Frank was opening. I'll summarize the main points, Frank continued. Harold's business interests, including his partnership shares in Bennett and Associates Investment Group, passed to his son, Thomas Bennett, with the stipulation that 10% of annual profits be directed to a charitable foundation Harold has established. Thomas nodded, unsurprised by this first provision. The family home at 47 Maple Avenue, along with all its contents, remains the sole property of Eleanor Bennett for her lifetime. Upon her death, the property will be sold and the proceeds divided equally between Thomas and Rebecca Bennett. Thomas's head snapped up. What? The house was supposed to come to me directly. Frank continued as if he hadn't heard the interruption. Harold's investment portfolio, valued at approximately $4.5 million as of last quarter, has been placed in an irrevocable trust with Eleanor Bennett as the primary beneficiary. Upon her death, 25% will go to Rebecca Bennett, 25% to Thomas Bennett, and the remaining 50% to Harold's grandchildren's education funds. That's impossible, Thomas interrupted, his face flushing. Those accounts were jointly managed by my father and me. I should have direct control of those assets. Frank looked at Thomas over the rim of his glasses. As I was saying, the trust is irrevocable and will be managed by Granite Trust Company, Not by any family member. As Frank continued reading through the will's provisions, detailing various smaller bequests and arrangements, Thomas's expression darkened. When Frank finally closed the folder, the room was silent except for the sound of Thomas's agitated breathing. "This is completely unacceptable," Thomas finally said, his voice tight with suppressed rage. "My father would never have cut me out like this. He must have been influenced unduly while he was medicated and vulnerable." Frank shook his head. "I anticipated this reaction, which is why I took extra precautions." Harold was examined by 2 independent physicians before signing these documents. Both certified his mental competence. Additionally, our meetings were video recorded with Harold's permission. Thomas turned to me, his eyes accusing. "You did this. You manipulated him when he was dying, turned him against me." "Your father made these decisions, Thomas," I replied quietly. "He wanted to ensure I would be secure for the rest of my life." "Secure?" Thomas scoffed. "You've effectively taken control of the entire family fortune." "Not control, Thomas. Protection. And not the entire fortune. You have the business, which is what you always wanted." Thomas stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I'll contest this. I'll prove he wasn't competent." Frank sighed. "You can certainly try, Thomas. But I should warn you that Harold anticipated that reaction as well. There's a contest clause in the will. If any beneficiary challenges the will and loses, their entire inheritance is forfeited and redirected to charity." Thomas froze, clearly calculating the risk. His portion of the business was valuable, but not worth losing on a legal gamble he was unlikely to win. "This isn't over," he finally said, gathering his coat. "Stephanie, we're leaving." After they had gone, Rebecca let out a long breath. "Dad really did think of everything, didn't he?" Frank smiled sadly. "He loved you both very much. Thomas too, despite everything. But he was a practical man, and he recognized that Thomas's financial judgment had become compromised by greed." As we left Frank's office, I felt strangely light, as if a burden I had carried for months had finally been lifted. Thomas had shown his true colors, and while the pain of his betrayal would never fully heal, I was free of any illusions about my son. "What will you do now, Mom?" Rebecca asked as we walked to our cars. "Will you go back to the house?" I thought about the home filled with memories of Harold, both joyful and painful. "Not right away. I think I need some time to figure out what comes next." What came next would surprise us all, Thomas most of all. In the weeks following the will reading, Thomas made several attempts to negotiate changes to the trust arrangements. Each time, Frank politely but firmly reminded him that the terms were irrevocable. Eventually, after consulting with his own attorney and realizing his position was legally untenable, Thomas grudgingly accepted the situation. I stayed at the Marriott for a week before returning to the house. Rebecca remained with me for another 2 weeks, helping me sort through Harold's belongings and providing emotional support. Those quiet evenings with my daughter were healing, allowing us to share memories of Harold and strengthen our bond. Thomas kept his distance during this time, communicating only through terse emails regarding business matters that required my signature. Stephanie made one awkward visit, ostensibly to drop off a casserole but clearly sent to gather intelligence on my plans for the house. I was polite but revealed nothing. As the initial shock and grief began to subside, I found myself contemplating the future more actively. The house, once filled with laughter and family gatherings, now felt cavernous and empty. Each room held memories of Harold, some comforting, others now painful after Thomas's betrayal. 3 months after Harold's death, I made a decision. I contacted a real estate agent, not the one Stephanie had brought to the house, but a woman recommended by Rebecca's friend in San Francisco. The house sold within 2 weeks, significantly above asking price due to its prime location and excellent condition. The day the sold sign went up, Thomas called for the first time since the funeral. "You're selling the house?" he demanded without preamble. "Without consulting me?" "It's my house to sell, Thomas," I replied calmly. The will was very clear on that point. "Where are you going to live?" "One of those depressing senior apartments." "I've purchased a condominium in San Francisco, near Rebecca and her family." The silence on the other end of the line was telling. Thomas had never imagined I would move across the country, removing myself completely from his sphere of influence. What about the furniture? The antiques? Dad's collections? He finally asked. I've had everything appraised. Items of particular sentimental value to you and Rebecca will be distributed fairly. The rest will be sold, and the proceeds will go into the grandchildren's education funds. Frank has all the details. Another long silence. You've thought of everything, haven't you? His voice held a new note, something between respect and resignation. Your father taught me well, I replied simply. The move to San Francisco was both challenging and liberating. At 67, starting over in a new city was daunting, but being near Rebecca and her family provided the support I needed. My new condominium was modern and manageable, with stunning views of the bay and a doorman who quickly became a friend. The first 6 months were difficult. I missed Harold desperately, and despite everything, I missed the son I had raised and loved. There were days when grief overwhelmed me, when I questioned all the decisions that had led to this point. But gradually, I began to build a new life. I joined a book club at the local library. I took a watercolor painting class, something I had always wanted to try but never had time for. I volunteered at Rebecca's children's school, reading to kindergartners once a week. Small steps, but each one took me further from the shadow of Thomas's betrayal, and closer to rediscovering who Eleanor Bennett was beyond being Harold's wife and Thomas's mother. Meanwhile, across the country, Thomas was facing challenges of his own. Without Harold's steady guidance, the investment firm began to struggle. Thomas's aggressive strategies alienated several key clients, and without access to the family trust funds to cover shortfalls, the business faced real financial pressure for the first time. 6 months after I moved, Stephanie filed for divorce. Rebecca heard through mutual friends that the final straw had been the realization that there would be no windfall inheritance to maintain their lavish lifestyle. With the business struggling and their personal finances overextended, the marriage couldn't withstand the strain. I felt no satisfaction at this news, only sadness for my grandchildren whose lives were being disrupted. Through Rebecca, I made sure they knew their grandmother was always there for them, regardless of what was happening between their parents. A year after Harold's death, I received an unexpected email from Thomas. It was brief and stiffly formal, but it represented the first acknowledgement of his behavior. Mother, I've been reflecting on my actions following Dad's death. They were inexcusable. The business is stabilizing now, and I'm working with a financial advisor to address my personal spending habits. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know I recognize my failures. Thomas. I didn't respond immediately, needing time to process this tentative olive branch. Eventually, I sent a short reply thanking him for his message and asking about the grandchildren. Thus began a cautious, sporadic correspondence that slowly increased in frequency and warmth. Around this time, I also found a new purpose that would have made Harold proud. Through a chance conversation at my book club, I connected with a women's shelter that needed volunteers to teach basic financial literacy. Many of the women were escaping abusive relationships and had never managed their own money. I discovered I had absorbed more financial knowledge from Harold over the years than I realized, and sharing these skills with women in vulnerable positions was deeply fulfilling. The program grew, and eventually, with support from the charitable foundation Harold had established, we developed a formal curriculum and expanded to 3 additional shelters in the Bay Area. I named it Harold's Legacy, and for the first time since his death, I felt he was truly with me in this new chapter of my life. 2 years after moving to San Francisco, I invited Thomas to visit. Our relationship remained fragile, but I wanted my grandchildren to know their grandmother's home, and I believed in the possibility of redemption, however partial. The visit was awkward at first, but seeing Thomas interact with his sister's family without the cloud of inheritance hanging over everything gave me hope that he was genuinely changing. On his last evening in San Francisco, Thomas and I sat on my balcony watching the sunset over the Golden Gate Bridge. I keep trying to understand how I became that person, he said quietly. The one who could throw his mother out after his father's funeral. We all have darkness in us, Thomas, I replied. The question is whether we recognize it and choose differently next time. He nodded, staring into his glass. Dad knew, didn't he? That's why he set everything up the way he did. He knew you were struggling with priorities. He hoped you would find your way back. I'm trying, Thomas said, and for the first time in years I believed him. As I approach my 70th birthday, I sometimes marvel at how differently my life turned out from what I had planned. I never expected to be a widow at 67, to be betrayed by my son, to start over in a new city, or to find purpose in teaching financial independence to vulnerable women. Harold used to say that life's greatest tests reveal who we truly are. My test came the day of his funeral, when my son showed me his true character and I had to show mine in response. I'm grateful that Harold's foresight gave me the tools to protect myself, but I'm even more grateful for the strength I discovered within myself during that darkest moment. If there's wisdom I can share from this journey, it's this: prepare for the storms, even when the sky seems clear. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong. And remember that sometimes, the greatest betrayals can lead to unexpected freedom, if we're brave enough to walk away and start anew. What about you? Have you ever had to start over after a betrayal or loss? Or have you witnessed family dynamics change dramatically after the loss of a loved one? Share your experiences in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need to hear that it's never too late to begin again. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember, sometimes the ending of one chapter is just the beginning of a more beautiful one.